How can an apologist who wants to argue for God's existence make the claim that science cannot, even in principle, prove God exists? Well, that is the claim I'm making today, that science cannot prove on its own that God does or does not exist. So I've been studying apologetics and philosophy for about 20 years and teaching it and learning about it. And my thought on this has evolved over the years. I've studied a lot of arguments for God's existence, both from philosophical areas and supposedly scientific ones. And I've come to believe in the last few years that ultimately science cannot prove that God exists. What do I mean by that? Okay. Well, what is science? First of all, science historically has been the idea that a subject is able to demonstrate conclusions or prove things in a systematic way. And so fields like philosophy and theology were traditionally considered sciences. Nowadays, when we hear the word science, what really is meant are the positive sciences or the natural sciences, like biology, chemistry, physics, and those kind of things. And my claim is that those areas, the natural sciences that we talk about today, cannot, in principle, prove that God exists or prove that he doesn't exist either. How can I say that? What is natural? Natural science studies what? It studies nature. It studies the physical world around us. In 2019, I debated atheist Michael Shermer on the topic of God's existence and the problem of evil. And we had a little bit of back and forth also in his magazine called Skeptic. And I suggest checking it out. If you want to look at some interesting topics, he does have some in here. And this was a fun debate that I was able to have with him. Now, Richard Carrier, who is a well-known atheist as well, wrote a blog article against my article in this magazine. I'll leave a link to that in the description, as well as a blog article response from my blog about what Richard said. And my main contention in that Skeptic article is that natural science does not and cannot prove God exists because natural science studies nature. Now, if God is a supernatural being, then it just goes to reason that a discipline like physics or biology that study the natural world in the physical sense could not demonstrate something that exists immaterially. Interestingly, Michael Shermer agreed with me in our debate that hypothetically, if God exists, the natural science cannot prove him or demonstrate that he exists. But what can science tell us about the natural world? Well, it can tell us how it works. It can tell us how biology works. It can tell us about the physical nature and structure of the universe and how different things work together, different systems and all that kind of stuff. It can even tell us that there is some kind of design, if you want to bring in the notion of design, which some may even say is a more of a philosophical area as well. And if you want to grant the validity of the intelligent design arguments, then we can agree, per those arguments, that there is a designer to the universe and to biological life. If you want to just grant that, even though that I think as well is going to import some philosophical notions that we don't necessarily get from physical science. But if we grant that argument from intelligent design just works and is really more of a scientific argument, then we'll get that the universe as a design structure can give us the notion that there's some kind of a designer to it. Even though I'm going to hold that in the strict sense, even that is making a philosophical move. What can science not tell us about God? Well, it cannot tell us about any kind of supernatural cause because, again, natural science studies nature. And if God exists as a supernatural being, then by definition, natural science cannot tell us about anything outside of its own domain, namely nature. Now, Richard Carrier, the atheist I mentioned a while ago, argues that if God exists, then science should be able to discover him and study him because science can study everything. But I don't see how that's possible because natural science studies things through a physical medium, empirical investigation, and looking at the data that we see in the universe. And if God is an immaterial being, then I will grant that we can see his effects in the universe. But I don't think that we can have a direct access to God through empirical investigation, whether that's physics or math or anything else. So science cannot give us a supernatural cause. It also cannot tell us how many designers there are. Even if we could grant that the intelligent design arguments, which I think are fabulous arguments, by the way, I think the intelligent design arguments are very, very powerful. And I think they're very persuasive in showing that there is at least one intelligent designer. I mean, the more we know about biology and the more we know about cosmology and those kinds of areas, the more that we learn and realize just how amazing the design of the universe is. In fact, I'm a visiting scholar with Reasons to Believe. I have some work on their website. I'll leave a link to that as well in the description. I presented this to them actually this year when I went to visit them. And so I think that the intelligent design arguments are very persuasive. I think they're very powerful. And I think that practically speaking, that they will move someone possibly from atheism to some kind of a theism. In fact, I think that's just what happened with Antony Flew, who was, according to one book titled The 20th Century's Most Notorious Atheist. He was converted, or I think it was 2005, because of the design type arguments. And there's some debate about whether he was converted more to theism or deism. Gary Habermas, who was a friend of his, said that he was converted to full-blown theism, not to Christianity, but to theism, the idea that it was the creator and designer of the universe. So I don't misunderstand. I do think that the intelligent design arguments from biology and cosmology, whether we're looking through a microscope and looking at the smallest aspects of biological life, or the cosmological structures and constants that are required to help life exist, they're very powerful. I like the arguments. I'm just trying to say that at just the level of natural science, without importing philosophy into those arguments, we don't get anything beyond the actual physical world. Even if we could grant a designer, that does not mean the designer himself is an immaterial supernatural agent. We can make further argumentation, I think, philosophically, to show that that is the case, but I don't think we can get there through natural science. Also, natural science does not give us creation ex nihilo. That creation is from nothing. So science, natural science, can give us that the universe possibly, if you want to look and say at the Big Bang cosmology, there was a beginning to it. That's the closest we're going to get to showing that there is some kind of a beginning to the universe. But the design arguments themselves, as design arguments, won't get us that. Now, the cosmological arguments will get us closer to that. But then we have to import, again, philosophy and look at the nature of that cause. What is that? Is it personal? Is it intelligent? And so forth. So science can bolster proof for God's existence. They can show that there is an amazing amount of design and complexity within the world, whether we're looking at the molecular level, the biological level, the atomic level, or the cosmological level. There's a great amount of design in the structure of the universe. But the question of God's existence is ultimately a philosophical one. It is the question of, is there an immaterial cause to the universe? That is not a question for natural science, because, again, natural science studies nature. And unless you want to identify God with nature, which would be some kind of pantheism, possibly panentheism, where you have God in nature in a sense and not identical with it like you would with pantheism. If theism is true, that God is separate from the universe and not part of nature, then science on its own without philosophy is not going to be able to supersede the level of its own areas of study to get us to a supernatural, that is a cause that is above nature, supernatural, above nature. So we need philosophy to do that, if that's the question for philosophers. Now you might be asking, isn't that a theological question? And this is where theology and philosophy sort of intersect here. When we look at the nature of what's called natural revelation that Paul talks about in Romans 1, that we can know about God's divine nature and eternal power through what has been made, that is technically the study of theology. But trying to arrive at the existence of that being really is starting with the physical aspect of the universe and then arriving at or working backwards to the cause, starting with the effect and working back to the cause. That's going to be a philosophical move. And the fancy term is a demonstratio quia argument, where you're starting with the effect and reasoning backwards to the cause. That is philosophical in nature. And ultimately, it is similar to natural theology. And so we could put this under natural theology as well, about studying God through nature and seeing if he exists. That will be theology because it's studying God. There's a little bit of a distinction between natural theology and metaphysics. I'm not going to get into that too much here. My point is that science is great, gives us really strong arguments for design, but they're limited in that they can't give us one designer, they can't give us creation ex nihilo, they can't give us anything beyond the universe. That is a question for philosophy. So we need to study philosophy, as C.S. Lewis said, because we need to make sure that we're not doing bad philosophy on accident. And good philosophy needs to exist because bad philosophy needs to be answered. So there's a lot of Christians who have an aversion to philosophy. They say that philosophy is pagan, that applying reason to God, saying that we can show God exists through reason, is some kind of a pagan notion. God gave us the powers of rationality. That's what makes us different from all the other animals. Why not use that rationality to, as Paul says in Romans 1, know him through creation? And we can't just say that it's pagan, because everyone has the ability to reason, pagans and non-pagans. And the ability to reason to God isn't something that just the pagans did. Theists and Christians have done that too. So what would be an example of a philosophical proof? Well, some of the most well-known are attributed to Thomas Aquinas, his famous 5 ways. Let me give you one of them. This is a version of the cosmological argument, so-called because it's based on the cosmos, the world around us. And again, Paul in Romans 1 says we can know God through the cosmos, through the world around us. And Aquinas, in the second way for God's existence, the basic gist of the argument goes like this. You can't have one thing causing itself or one thing causing something else going backwards to infinity. In other words, something cannot be the efficient cause of itself, or the cause by which it exists, or the reason that it exists in and of itself, because it would have to exist prior to causing its own existence, which is a contradiction. It can't exist in order to bring about its existence. It would have already existed. So it would need something else. It would need another cause, some kind of an antecedent cause. Well, that cause either is caused by something else or it isn't. If it is caused by something else, then that cause is either caused by something else or isn't. That kind of causal chain cannot go into infinity. And so Aquinas says there's got to be some kind of ultimate efficient cause, not just in the past, but right here and now, upholding all things that exist. The example that my colleague Richard Howe uses is that of a train. If you've got a boxcar being pulled by another boxcar, someone could say, well, what causes that boxcar to move? And the answer could be, well, the boxcar in front of it is pulling it. Well, then what causes that to move? Well, the boxcar in front of it. The boxcar cannot be an answer to infinity. There ultimately has to be an engine that accounts for the movement of the train, if you can consider the boxcar as somewhat existing or being caused to move in a sense. Ultimately, there's got to be an efficient cause of all things that exist. So now we're at the level of existence, which transcends scientific study. Science studies physical beings that exist, which like physics, or physical living beings like biology. But philosophy studies existence as such, not simply in the biology box, not just in the physics box, but any kind of existence. That would include the immaterial human soul, angels, God, things like that, which is why philosophy is of a broader category than science. Also, it's important to understand that scientists need to use philosophy even to do science, because philosophy really is nothing more than our understanding of what the world is, our view of reality, our view of knowledge, our view of truth, goodness, and beauty. and the use of logic. That's really what philosophy is, and so scientists have to use that. So that's a little bit of a difference between the intelligent design arguments, which say things like the eye is very designed, or the human body is so designed, or the cosmos is so designed, that there's got to be some kind of a designer. That's a great argument, but it will not get us full-blown classical theism. It will only give us, at most, a designer. It can't really give us creation ex nihilo without going to that cosmological step. We get that with philosophy. We get the creation ex nihilo. We get that there is one ultimate infinite being. And so the philosophy arguments are broader and get more at the heart of it. So I hope that this was enlightening to you. I hope this has wanted to encourage you to study philosophy more. There's a lot of good works out there to study God through nature. I will leave some links to those in the description as well. My favorite is An Introduction to Natural Theology by Maurice Holloway. It's not the easiest book in the world to read, but it's a good one. I think it's probably one of the best ones I've read on natural theology. So I love what science has done. My wife is a scientist. Her area is environmental science, herpetology, and she works in science education. And I love astronomy. One of my favorite pastimes is to go look through a telescope and just look at and admire the night sky. So I appreciate science. I appreciate the way that the design arguments work, but I think it needs an extra bit of oomph from the philosophical world as well to get us to a supernatural cause. So thanks for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.